Good morning, y'all. I want to start today with something a little different than how I usually open these tropical weather updates because I think it sets the right tone for everything I'm about to tell you. And it reflects something I genuinely believe about how weather information should be communicated to real people in real communities. There is a disturbance in the Eastern Caribbean right now that the National Hurricane Center is monitoring. That sentence alone, a disturbance being monitored, is the kind of sentence that can be interpreted in about 100 different ways depending on who is delivering it and what their motivation is. In the wrong hands, that sentence becomes a headline designed to generate maximum anxiety regardless of what the science actually says. In the right hands, it becomes the beginning of an honest, grounded science-first conversation about what is actually happening, what the realistic range of outcomes looks like, and what, if anything, the people in the potential path of this system should be doing differently today than they would be doing otherwise. This channel is committed to being the right hands. So let me tell you everything I know about this disturbance this morning, the good, the uncertain, and the genuinely concerning, and let me do it in a way that respects both the science and the people who are going to be affected by whatever this system does or does not become. Setting the scene, what we are actually looking at. Let me paint the picture of what this disturbance actually looks like right now, because the satellite presentation of a tropical system tells an enormous amount of the story, and I think walking y'all through what I am seeing on the imagery this morning is the best way to ground everything else I'm going to say. On the visible satellite imagery, the daytime satellite picture that shows us the cloud patterns in detail, the disturbance in the Eastern Caribbean is presenting as a broad, somewhat disorganized area of deep convection. That means thunderstorms. Tall, moisture-laden thunderstorm towers erupting through the lower and mid-levels of the atmosphere, spreading out into anvil clouds at the top, creating that characteristic white mass of cloud that you can see clearly from space. The convection is persistent. It has been firing repeatedly in the same general area for the past 24 to 36 hours, which tells us that the atmospheric setup in this location is at least somewhat supportive of sustained deep convection. That is not nothing. Persistent, deep convection in the tropics is the foundation that every tropical cyclone is built on. But here is what the imagery is also telling me that I think is equally important. The convection right now is not well organized around a defined center. There is no clear low-level circulation that I can identify with confidence on the satellite or in the surface analysis. The thunderstorm activity is spread over a fairly large area, probably 300 to 400 miles across, without the tight, spiraling banding structure that you see when a tropical system is organizing efficiently around a developing center. The system has the raw material of a tropical cyclone, the moisture, the instability, the tropical warmth. But it has not yet demonstrated the organizational coherence that separates a disturbance from a developing tropical cyclone. That distinction matters enormously, and I want y'all to hold on to it as I walk through the rest of this forecast, because the single most important forecasting question for this system right now is not how strong will it get, or where will it go, it is, will it organize? Everything else flows from the answer to that question. The development factors, what the atmosphere is offering. Let me talk about the environmental factors that are going to determine whether this system has a realistic pathway to development, because this is where the honest complexity of tropical forecasting lives. And I want to give you the full picture rather than just the headline version, starting with the sea surface temperatures, because the ocean is always the first place I look when I am evaluating a tropical disturbance. The Eastern Caribbean sea surface temperatures right now are running at 28 to 29 degrees Celsius across the area where the disturbance is currently located. That is comfortably above the general 26-degree threshold for tropical cyclone support, and it is warm enough to provide a meaningful energy source for a developing system. As the disturbance tracks westward, which is the general direction of motion expected over the next several days based on the steering flow at low and mid-levels, it is going to be moving over water that maintains or slightly increases in temperature. The Western Caribbean runs warmer than the Eastern Caribbean through much of the peak hurricane season, and the upper ocean heat content in the Western Caribbean is currently running above the long-term average. From a pure ocean thermodynamic standpoint, the fuel supply for this system improves as it moves. The atmospheric moisture profile is also supportive. The mid-level relative humidity values across the Eastern and Central Caribbean right now are running in the 65 to 75% range. I want to explain why that number matters, because it is not something that gets discussed enough in tropical weather coverage. Dry air, low mid-level relative humidity, is one of the most efficient killers of developing tropical systems. When dry air gets entrained into the circulation of a developing storm, it causes the thunderstorm towers to evaporate before they can reach their full depth. It cools the mid-level warm core that is essential for tropical cyclone structure, and it essentially starves the system of the thermodynamic engine it needs to maintain itself and intensify. The Saharan air layer, that hot, dusty, dry air mass that flows off the African continent and spreads across the tropical Atlantic, is one of the primary mechanisms by which developing tropical waves get destroyed before they can become hurricanes. Right now, the Saharan air layer influence across the Caribbean is relatively limited compared to where it has been at various points this season, and the relatively moist mid-level environment is a meaningful positive factor for this system. Now, let me talk about the wind shear, because this is where the picture gets more complicated and where the honest uncertainty in this forecast lives. The upper-level wind shear across the eastern Caribbean, remember, shear is the change in wind speed and direction with height, and high shear tears tropical systems apart, while low shear allows them to develop, is currently running at a level that I would characterize as marginal. Not prohibitively high, not favorably low. Right in that frustrating middle zone where small changes in the large-scale atmospheric pattern can tip the balance toward development or suppression with very little warning. The specific shear values I'm looking at this morning across the disturbance area are running between 15 and 25 knots. Anything below 15 knots is generally considered favorable for tropical development. Anything above 30 knots is generally considered hostile. We are sitting in the gray zone between those thresholds, and the directional consistency of the shear, the degree to which the shear vector is coherently organized versus coming from varying directions at different levels, is adding additional uncertainty to how impactful it is actually being on the system's ability to organize. The key forecasting question on the shear, and what I have been watching the model runs do with this over the past 48 hours, is whether that shear relaxes meaningfully as the system tracks westward into the central Caribbean over the next 3 to 5 days. And this is where I have to be honest with y'all about the model disagreement, because it is real and it is significant. The European model, the ECMWF, has been showing a more aggressive shear relaxation over the central and western Caribbean beginning around day 3 to 4, opening up a window of favorable conditions that it then uses to develop the system into a tropical cyclone of some significance. The American model, the GFS, has been less aggressive on that shear relaxation, keeping values in the marginal to unfavorable range for a longer period and producing a less developed or entirely non-developing solution. When the two most trusted global models are giving you meaningfully different answers about the key environmental variable that determines whether a system develops, you have genuine forecast uncertainty, and I will not pretend otherwise. The track possibilities, where could this go? Let me talk about the track possibilities for this disturbance, understanding that track forecasting is significantly more reliable than intensity forecasting for tropical systems, and that even with the current development uncertainty, we can say some meaningful things about where the system is likely to be over the next week based on the large-scale steering flow. The disturbance is currently embedded in the broad easterly trade wind flow that dominates the low-level circulation across the Caribbean during this time of year. That flow is going to carry the system generally westward to west-northwestward over the next 2 to 3 days as it traverses the central Caribbean. The steering current in the mid-levels, the 5,000 to 10,000 foot layer that is most relevant for non-intensified tropical systems, is consistent across the models in the direction of motion, if not in the ultimate position, and it points toward the Western Caribbean as the system's location in roughly 4 to 5 days. From the Western Caribbean, the range of possibilities broadens significantly and is strongly dependent on how the system has evolved by that point. A stronger, better organized system that has been able to build its own circulation modifies the steering flow around it and tends to track more poleward, northward, earlier, which in this setup would favor tracks toward the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, the western tip of Cuba, or potentially the Gulf of Mexico, depending on the exact timing and the configuration of the subtropical ridge to the north. A weaker, more disorganized system that has not achieved significant tropical cyclone status by that point would be more at the mercy of the large-scale flow and could track further westward before eventually recurving, potentially impacting Central America, the Yucatan, or, in the furthest west solutions, even the Bay of Campeche. I want to be very direct with y'all about what I am not going to do in this forecast. I'm not going to draw a line on a map and tell you this storm is going to hit a specific city or a specific coastline. The honest truth is that the uncertainty in this forecast at day 5 through 7 is enormous. It is normal for this lead time, and anyone who is giving you a confident, precise landfall forecast for a system that has not yet even demonstrated organized circulation is giving you false confidence that is not grounded in what the science can actually tell us right now. What I can tell you is that the entire Gulf Coast, from Brownsville through the Florida Keys, and the Western Caribbean coastlines, including the Yucatan Peninsula, Western Cuba, and Central America, need to be paying attention to this system and should be at a heightened level of weather awareness as it tracks westward, and the forecast picture clarifies over the next several days. The islands, in the immediate path, the near-term threat. Before I talk about the longer-range implications of this system for the Gulf Coast and the United States, I want to make sure I spend real time on the communities that are in the immediate path of this disturbance right now and over the next 48 to 72 hours, because they deserve just as much attention as the downstream communities that might be affected later. The Lesser Antilles, the chain of islands stretching from the Virgin Islands southward through Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Jamaica, and the smaller island nations of the Eastern Caribbean, are going to experience the direct impacts of this disturbance as it traverses the region over the next 2 to 3 days, regardless of whether it develops into a named tropical cyclone. And I want to be clear about what those impacts look like for communities in the path, because a disorganized tropical disturbance is not a benign weather event, even when it never gets a name or a number. Heavy rainfall is the primary immediate threat. A broad, moisture-rich tropical disturbance moving through the mountainous terrain of the Caribbean islands, the mountains of Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Jamaica, can produce extraordinary rainfall totals through orographic enhancement, where the mountains force moist air upward rapidly and wring rainfall out of it at rates far exceeding what the large-scale rainfall forecast would suggest. The interaction between tropical moisture and complex terrain is one of the most dangerous and most underappreciated flash flooding mechanisms in the Caribbean, and communities on the windward slopes of mountainous islands need to be taking the rainfall threat from this system very seriously over the next 24 to 48 hours, regardless of development status. Flooding rains of 3 to 6 inches are likely across portions of the island chain, with localized totals of 8 to 12 inches possible in the areas where orographic enhancement is most efficient, the interior mountains, and the windward slopes that face the disturbances approach. That is enough rainfall in a short enough time frame to produce life-threatening flash flooding in the steep, narrow river valleys that characterize the terrain of many Caribbean islands. Road washouts, bridge failures, and the isolation of mountain communities that can happen within hours of a heavy rainfall event are very real possibilities. I'm asking the residents of Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Jamaica, and the island nations of the Lesser Antilles to be taking the flooding threat from the system seriously today, not when the rain starts, and to avoid low-lying areas and flood-prone roads during the period of heaviest rainfall. Seas will also be running higher than normal across the region, with swells generated by the disturbance's circulation producing dangerous conditions for small craft and coastal areas. Anyone with maritime activities planned in the eastern and central Caribbean over the next 72 hours needs to be closely monitoring the marine forecasts from the National Hurricane Center and local meteorological services. What this means for the states. Gulf Coast, awareness without alarm. Now let me bring this back to the United States Gulf Coast, because I know that is where a significant portion of the people watching this video live, and it is a fair question to ask what, if anything, this disturbance in the Eastern Caribbean means for you right now. The honest answer, and I want to give you the honest answer rather than the alarming answer or the dismissive answer, is this. Right now, today, this disturbance does not represent an imminent specific threat to any particular portion of the United States Gulf Coast. The system is not organized. The track forecast has enormous uncertainty at the lead times that are relevant for Gulf Coast landfall scenarios. And there are multiple atmospheric features between this disturbance and the Gulf of Mexico that could significantly alter its character and trajectory before it ever gets there. What this disturbance does represent, honestly and accurately assessed, is a system that warrants active monitoring by Gulf Coast residents and a prompt to take stock of your tropical preparedness in a calm, deliberate way while you have the time to do so thoughtfully. Hurricane season preparedness that happens in the absence of an immediate threat is the most effective preparedness. The decisions you make about your evacuation plan, your supply kit, your surge zone awareness, your insurance coverage, those decisions are better made right now, today, when there is no storm on your doorstep, no traffic on the evacuation routes, and no empty shelves at the grocery store, than they are made in the 48-hour window before a potential major hurricane landfall. So let me ask you directly, do you know which hurricane evacuation zone you are in? Do you know the route you would take and where you would go? Do you have a 72-hour supply kit? Do you know your family's plan for pets, for elderly relatives, for family members who need extra time to mobilize? If the answer to any of those questions is no, then this disturbance, whatever it ultimately becomes, has done you a favor by prompting you to answer them now. Y'all call in the overnight tropical threat. Y'all, let me take just a moment to talk about y'all call in the context of tropical weather, because I think a lot of people think of it purely as a tornado warning tool, and I want to make sure you understand its relevance in the tropical weather context as well. Tropical systems, even disorganized disturbances, produce severe weather well ahead of and around their circulation. Squall lines, embedded tornadoes, brief spin-up tornadoes in the outer rain bands, these are documented, well-understood hazards associated with tropical systems, and they do not arrive on a schedule that respects whether you are awake or asleep. When a tropical system is in the Gulf and its outer rain bands are sweeping across the Gulf Coast at 2 or 3 in the morning, the tornado threat embedded in those rain bands is real. It is fast moving, and it is exactly the kind of overnight threat that Y'all Call was built to protect you from. A direct phone call to your number the moment a tornado warning covers your specific location, cutting through Do Not Disturb, ringing until you answer, getting you up and moving toward shelter, is $14.95 for a full year. If you live on or near the Gulf Coast and you do not have Y'all Call set up, this disturbance in the Caribbean is the reminder to do it today. Closing, y'all, let me close this forecast the way it deserves to be closed. With honesty, with proportion, and with a clear statement of what I want you to take away from everything I have told you this morning. A tropical disturbance in the Eastern Caribbean is being monitored. That is true. The environment it is moving into has characteristics that could support development into a tropical cyclone over the next several days. That is also true. The track forecast has enough uncertainty that the entire Gulf Coast and Western Caribbean need to be paying attention. That is true too. And none of those true things require panic, require dramatic immediate action, or require you to spend this morning in a state of anxiety. What they require is awareness. Steady, informed, grounded awareness of what is happening in the tropics, a commitment to checking in on the forecast every day as this system evolves and the picture clarifies, and a prompt to make sure your preparedness foundation is solid so that when and if the forecast does become more specific and more urgent, you are already ready to act rather than starting from zero. I am going to be updating this system every single morning. Every model run that changes the picture meaningfully is going to bring me in front of you with new information. Subscribe and ring that bell. Share this video with your Gulf Coast family and friends. And keep your eyes on the Caribbean over the next week, because this story is still being written and the atmosphere has not finished deciding what it is going to do. Stay informed, stay prepared. And as always, stay safe out there. I love y'all.